Good morning, friends. Today is Thursday and it's day 32, and we are going to study Luke chapter 20, verses 1 through 26. And our sweet treat today is that Jesus is crafty. That's a new one, right? All right, so yesterday we ended chapter 19 with Luke telling us that once Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he taught in the temple every day. He had driven out the corrupt merchants who were working hand in hand with the corrupt priests. And this really angered the chief priests and the teachers of the law to the point that they hated him and wanted him dead. But the people were hanging on to his every word, so they dared not make a move against him. Today we begin chapter 20 with Jesus there in the temple being confronted by these priests and lawyers. They want to know on what authority or on whose authority Jesus is there boldly and courageously teaching and preaching and running all the corrupt out of the temples. Jesus decides to answer their question with a question. He asks them if John's baptism was from heaven or from men. The leaders gather together to talk through their answers, and they conclude that if they say it's from heaven, then Jesus will ask them why they didn't believe him. And if they say it was from men, the crowd around them would certainly mob them and stone them to death because they were devout followers of the prophet John. So they decide their answer is simply that they don't know. Jesus, knowing exactly how this would play out, turns to them and says, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do things." Now, Reverend Dr. G. Campbell Morgan was a British evangelist, preacher, teacher, and author in the late 1800s. Regarding this passage, Morgan said this: "These answers of his were not the sharp retorts of smartness, but the final utterances of a wisdom which revealed the ignorance of the questions." I just love that. Jesus honestly was not being a smart aleck, but he was being smart. Pastor David Guzik says, by replying with this question, Jesus did not evade their question. Instead, he used the question to explain who he is and to expose the hypocrisy of the leaders. If John was from God, then he was right in proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. And if this was true, then Jesus had all authority. Jesus knew that if they did not recognize his authority, no amount of arguing with them would soothe their suspicions. Recognizing a good teaching moment when he sees one, Jesus decides to tell another parable. This parable probably resonates with the crowd better than it resonates with us today because Jesus uses a scenario that was very common during that time period and in that region. He says that a man planted a large vineyard and then he leased out the property to a number of tenants. Then the man went away to a far country for an extended period of time. As was the custom, the vineyard owner sent a servant back to the vineyard and to collect some of the wine that had been made there. But the tenants beat the servant and they sent him away empty-handed. So the vineyard owner sends another servant, and he too is beaten and sent away. Once again, the vineyard owner sends a third servant, and he is also beaten and cast out. So then the vineyard owner thinks on what he needs to do, and he decides that he will send his beloved son to the vineyard because surely they would love and respect his son. Sadly, when the son arrives, the tenants decide it would be best to kill the son because he's the heir. And if they can kill him, then someday the vineyard will be left to them. It was custom then that any land that was not claimed after 3 years it would go to whoever was working the land. So they're thinking the owner's far off, and the son, if they can kill him, then and he's the only heir, then they become the heir. Jesus says, what else could the vineyard owner do? He has to come and destroy. Did I say that part? I'm so sorry. Sadly, when the son arrives, the tenants decide it would be best to kill the son because he is the owner's heir, and if he is dead, they'll be able to claim the land for themselves. So they do. They kill the son. Jesus says, what else could the vineyard owner do? He has to come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. While the parable seems pretty straightforward and easy to understand, Jesus knew that this would resonate with this crowd on such a deep level. As devout Jews, most of them would recall that Israel was compared to a vineyard in the Old Testament. In the book of Isaiah, they would recognize that the tenants here were the religious leaders. These leaders did not own the people of Israel. They did not create them. They were merely stewards fulfilling a role that God had allowed them to possess. The vineyard wasn't theirs. In the parable, the owner of the vineyard tried time and time again to retrieve what was rightfully his from within his own vineyard, and time again the tenants denied him. When the owner sent his son, the tenants were filled with such greed that they killed him, foolishly expecting to benefit from his death by inheriting the vineyard. Jesus knows that he is the son in this story. He knows that God is the rightful owner of the vineyard of Israel, and that time after time, God has tried to retrieve what is rightfully his from his vineyard. Yet the priest and the religious leaders have denied him over and over. And so now Jesus is coming as the vineyard owner's son, fully knowing that he would be killed as well. The greed and the jealousy of the priests and lawyers would nail Jesus to a cross, which they expected to benefit from greatly. Yet as the vineyard owner responded to the parable, God would also destroy those who killed his son. The religious leaders in the crowd completely understood what this parable meant, and they were not happy. They respond in great shock and denial. So Jesus reminds them that Psalm 118 describes the Messiah's arrival in Jerusalem. He reminds them that this chapter says, the stone which the builders rejected will become the chief cornerstone. Jesus is not at all surprised by their rejection. He wants to remind them that it was prophesied that they would reject him, yet it wouldn't make him any less crucial to God's plan. Then he says that anyone who falls on that stone will be broken, but if the stone falls on someone else, it will crush them to powder. Likewise, when we come to Jesus, we are broken of our sin and our pride and our selfish ambitions, but anyone who rejects Christ will be crushed under the weight of his mighty authority. This angered the priests and the leaders so much that they truly wanted to snatch him up right then and there and kill him. But they knew they would never make it out alive if they tried. He was way too popular with the Jews around them. The final section of today's passage begins in verse 20, and here the Pharisees have decided that the best way to entrap Jesus is to send spies out among him that would pretend to be righteous followers so that they might hear something that might turn public opinion against Jesus. They figured the only chance that they have to kill him is if everybody else hates him too. And what's the best way to anger a crowd of Jews? Let them think that he's a Roman sympathizer. So one of the spies in the crowd speaks out and says, "Teacher, we know that you say and teach rightly, and you do not show personal favoritism. You teach the way of God in truth. So we ask, is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" They obviously thought that they had laid the perfect bait, greased with hollow flattery, but Jesus was not fooled or amused. Jesus knew that if he said that taxes should be paid, the crowd would accuse him of denying the sovereignty of God over Israel. And that if he said they shouldn't be paid, he would be publicly making himself an enemy of Rome. But Luke says that Jesus perceived their craftiness and asked with exasperation in his voice, "Why do you keep trying to test me?" He reminds them that Caesar's face is upon the coins that they spend, so that they must give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. These two things aren't separate. It's not one or the other. We're to do both. The coins the Jews possessed were imprinted with Caesar's likeness, and therefore were to be paid to him as the law dictated. Yet we are imprinted with the likeness of God, and we are to give ourselves to him fully and freely. I can only imagine how frustrated the Pharisees were when they realized that Jesus had just given them the perfect answer. Later we'll see that they take his words here and they twist them to use them against him. But at this moment, Luke says they marveled at his answer and they kept silent. Today's sweet treat is that Jesus is crafty or feisty or smart or cunning or whatever word you want to use. I know it's not exactly the religious term, and no other Bible study is going to teach you that Jesus is crafty or feisty. It's not one of the attributes of God we discuss. But since we're on this journey of knowing Jesus, I think it's important that we really look closely to who he is as a person. And I have to say, Jesus is pretty feisty here. He doesn't roll over and let the Pharisees walk all over him. And at the same time, he doesn't rebel against them. As Luke says about the Pharisees, about Jesus recognizing the Pharisees' craftiness, I feel like we can recognize the craftiness of Jesus. If it made the Pharisees marvel at him, how much more should we marvel at him as well? I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you back here tomorrow. Bye-bye.